Hi folks, welcome to the Saint Albans Message, the audio companion to the Saint Albans Messenger, where we feature Vermont-focused discussions not always heard in the public conversation to better explore our communities and to provide insights into the state's challenges. I'm your host, Josh Scheffler. For our first episode, we're jumping right into the middle of it. This election cycle, Republican candidate Joe Luneau is running against Democratic incumbent Mike McCarthy in the Franklin 3 district, and in the neighboring Franklin 7 district, Democratic candidate Zach Scheffler is running against Republican incumbent Casey Toof. I invited all four to talk more about the big challenges facing Vermonters, and I have to say the legislature has quite a lot on its plate. Ongoing demographic change and a lackluster housing market has created an increasingly dire economic situation for local and state governments, and almost every industry is warning alarm bells. Mental health challenges and a market for illegal drugs has created a desperate population. Rural hospitals are on track for cuts and consolidation. Some schools will likely need to be shuttered, others merged. Vermont's workforce is shrinking. Additionally, the housing market has been restricted for so long that Vermont has essentially chased away an entire generation. And to top it all off, everything costs more. Years of high inflation tied to the pandemic snarls has many ready to cut programs and services to counter Vermont's affordability issues. All these things happening. First question to Mike. How do we prioritize? How do we do all the things we need to do? Can you please solve all the world's problems?
Thanks for the very easy first question. I'm Mike McCarthy. I am running for my fifth term in the Vermont House, and I really appreciate the opportunity to do this new podcast with you. These questions about how do we have an economy that works for everyone in our community? Not just the people who already have a high income or already have wealth or already part of the kind of in crowd. I want to make sure that we can afford things like childcare. That's why we passed Act 76, so that families can find a spot, that people who are in the business of providing daycare and early education services can make an affordable living. That's an example where government's really done some things that are successful in Vermont, opening up over 1,000 new slots since we passed Act 76 at a really low cost per taxpayer. In your intro, you pointed out some things that are kind of broken, like the housing market, which we're all too slowly but making some progress on. I know we'll talk more about that later. But there are some things that are really strong that when I think back to when I came back to Franklin County in 2008, there were 50% of the first floor downtown spots where businesses used to be were open. Now most of those spots are filled. We have a lot of companies that their biggest problem is that they have jobs and they can't find people to fill them. And I would rather have that problem where we can use housing to provide more workforce and people want to live in our community than the reverse problem where we don't have enough jobs for people and our economy is really sagging. And the other thing that I'd point out as a bright spot is that wages are up. So while we're concerned about inflation, we're concerned about the cost of everything from groceries to public education, we also are seeing that a lot of Vermont households are making more money than they used to. And so our job in state government is really to make sure that when markets are broken, like the housing market or the childcare market, that we're able to provide a mix of regulation and investment that makes it possible for more Vermonters to afford those essentials.
Sure. And I think I want to piggyback off an idea you were talking about, at least in terms of kind of downtown has shifted and changed over the years, and this is an economic question as much as anything. Is like affordability. How do we pay for stuff? Like I want to give some conservative voices more here a chance to respond here.
Governor Scott consistently has the message that we need more taxpayers and not more taxes.
This is Joe Luneau speaking, by the way. He's the challenger to Mike McCarthy.
And so by whatever metric you utilize, we're one of the top 3, if not higher, most tax states in the country. So to increase the revenue side of things, I don't think is a vehicle by which we're going to be able to attract more people to help shoulder the burden. Part of Vermont's challenge is there are only a little over 600,000 people here to spread costs across for a state government. Were we to redraw state lines today, Vermont would not be a state. We'd probably be a county in, upstate New York or some combination thereof. So we need for the state to be a more attractive place for people to stay in or to move to. And there are a litany of people who are still, lifetime Vermonters. I just talked to a couple last night who are leaving for Florida in order to avoid a very onerous, in comparative terms, income and Social Security tax system. Vermont's one of 9 states that taxes Social Security at any level, and that certainly discourages retirees. Certainly there's been wage growth. I don't know that there's been real wage growth, but wage growth in an inflationary environment doesn't help retirees. They're really a class of folks, and an increasingly large class of folks that don't have the benefit of increased wages. They get the small CPI increase, and you end up in situations where we have like a property tax in this district this year of 15.5%, which is somewhere around 5 to 7 times the actual inflation rate this year. Where retirees who have done the right thing, have no mortgage on their house, aren't sure if they're going to be able to stay there for any sustained period of time.
Yeah, broadening the conversation, I wanted to pitch it to either Zach or Casey here. You guys are both, I think, the youngest members at our table outside of me. I don't know between you two. It doesn't matter.
I turned 40 in May.
All right, fair enough.
July.
Oh,
you got me.
Oh, I was wrong.
I'm ancient.
You got a month on him? That's fantastic.
Yes. I'm finishing up my 40s, but enjoying the end.
Anyway, I guess to one of our older members and one of our younger members, in terms of, Joe mentioned in terms of tax revenues, not sure where they're going to go in the next few years. Do you think that they're going to be on the upper end, on the lower end? How are we going to bring money into the state to pay for what we want to do?
I mean, I can jump in if that's all right.
Casey Toof coming in for the save. He's the current Republican incumbent representing Saint Albans City and Town.
Joe hit on a really good point that, we do have a spending problem. Our revenues have been fine, but I think we're going to see our revenues not be as healthy as they have been, and that's what we've seen. We've heard those recommendations that our revenues, they've been really steady for the last 5-6 years. And next year, I think that we're going to have to worry about how we spend and where we spend, and we're going to have to limit any kind of growth. But we have done some things in the legislature that have put us in this position. We are one of the highest tax states in the country. We did pass a child care bill, but it's at the expense of taxpayers, a $100 million payroll tax. Property taxes are up 13.1% in St. Albans Town, 15.5% in St. Albans City. The 20% increase in DMV fees was, I believe, a very regressive tax on low-income earners. But then we look at what's coming out next year. We have a $10 billion clean heat standard looking us in the face. That bill could cost us $10 billion. We just passed a bill last year for $1 billion in new electric rates. And every time that we raise a new tax on Vermonters, it kind of creates inflation because it expands how much it costs municipalities, how much it costs businesses, and we end up having to pay more. So we don't really have a revenue problem right now. We have a big spending problem, and that was kind of a phrase coined by Representative Beck in this legislature last year. But I feel like we are spending way too much. Last couple of years, it's over $500 million in new taxes and fees, and this is what I think people in Vermont are starting to feel that every time they open a new bill or they open up something that they have to pay.
Yeah. Well, your points make me think of some of the conversation around the national debt in terms of the percentage of GDP, right? Mm-hmm. So is some of the argument here that the state's spending essentially is taking up too much of a percentage of the state's GDP? Is that kind of where you're going, or because got to figure out if we're going to spend our way out or we're going to cut our way out.
Yeah, and like we spent, our budget's about $8.6 billion, I believe, and we only have 643,000 people. We have about the same budget as New Hampshire with half amount of people. Mm-hmm. So that's concerning to me, and that's we've seen costs go up in every single fund, or spending in every single fund in the last 10 years, while we've seen population kind of stay steady and our student population go down. And I know we're going to talk about education in a little bit, so I'll save it for that. But that's kind of where I'm at, is we need efficiencies in government, and we need to stop taxing people. I don't think we can tax our way out of this issue. I think Vermonters want some kind of relief.
Sure, and I think our Democratic candidates also would like to get in this conversation. Zach, you haven't spoken yet. What are some of your thoughts in terms of cutting taxes versus raising revenues versus cutting programs and all that?
Yeah, and again, thanks for having this conversation. I think it's like really important, right? You mentioned kind of a dichotomy there of cutting our way out and spending our way out. And I'd like to think of it as asking folks to do without, cutting services, cutting supports for people. That includes older Vermonters, that includes younger Vermonters. That's one side of the proposed solutions, and I think that our friends here on the conservative side should have an honest and straightforward conversation about what they're going to cut and what they're going to ask people to do without. On the flip side, I think that people in Vermont, we're talking about a low population, state, small state, rural state. People are our most valuable resource. People make the state's future bright and make things happen in Vermont. So, when we talk about spending, sure, we can talk about allocation and good governance. I think that's really basic, and I think everybody at this table wants good governance, right? But I'd like to think of it as investing in Vermonters to make it attractive in the state. People stay here, people flourish here, people start businesses. We're going to talk about a lot of things, but lowering costs on some of the most important aspects of life, things that give you a stable life in a state like Vermont. That's housing, that's childcare, that's healthcare. When so many things feel like they're going off the rails and we're doing so much to keep the state on track, I think we have to invest in that. I also think that paying taxes and contributing to your neighbors is one of the most patriotic things that you can do as a Vermonter and an American. And we ask a lot from our middle class folks. So when we have a tax conversation, I think we need to talk more about, where are we asking, or how are we asking others to pitch in? You mentioned high end, low end. I think that high income earners have the capacity to pitch in and help us in this moment, and that's bringing neighbors together to keep the state on track. So, that's the way I look at it. But certainly, obviously, also advocate for, good basic governance and a strong pocketbook. You got to keep a pocketbook straight at the same time.
Yeah. Well, let's get into that a little bit, just out of curiosity. Just what are some of the things that maybe can be restricted in the future? I mean, where are cost savings going to come from? Like what taxes, what programs? I mean, I hear a lot about the issue. I'm desperate for a solution. Anybody want to take that one? That's a big one, admittedly.
Yeah, so I think that one place where there's broad agreement between all of us is that economic development, increase in the number of houses and taxpayers, building up Vermont's wealth on the grand list and spreading out the cost of providing essential services to more taxpayers is really important. And I think when we take the approach that we took this last session, where we're trying to update our land use laws so that we continue to preserve some of those environmental protections and land use, but we update them so we remove duplication and we allow for more housing to actually be developed in the kinds of places like downtowns and village centers where we want to see more of it, to make that much easier. You're seeing, look in the city of St. Albans, when a municipality takes advantage of state and federal incentives, they can kickstart hundreds of units getting built. And I'm seeing those units getting built. I'm seeing people move into our community. We have a desirable place to live, and having those people here in our part of the state is great. In other parts of the state, though, like, we're really the envy of a lot of other areas in the state where they have essentially made their local regulations so restrictive that they can't really build any new housing. Or they just have geographic or water and wastewater issues that we don't have here in the city of St. Albans. And they're really struggling to be able to provide the services they need to staff positions that they need to staff, especially when it comes to those things that we've normally been volunteer roles in municipal governments, and even things like EMS. Like we worked on a bill for emergency medical services to try to help it be more affordable for volunteers to get the training that they need this year. So these are really incredibly important things to all of our communities that only happen when you have the ability for a strong economy and people to invest in a business or a home. And I got into this running for office primarily with the fact that, I had a little bakery and cafe, and there was no way that I could afford to pay for decent health care for employees. Yeah. Like that was what inspired me to do this. And so I'm constantly thinking about that.
Yeah, definitely. I want to jump topics a little here, because I think we're kicking around the edges of this idea of, we need people, right, for a lot of these things that we like to do. It's not just resources, it's people, human resources, if you would. So we're entering somewhat of a demographic trap in Vermont here. Fewer kids, more older adults. I'll segue a little bit into education about what that means. So Vermont has an education system set up for a population mix that doesn't really exist anymore. So what's the step up about? Like, obviously there's been a lot of talk about mergers and that sort of thing. Like, I know we have, the State House needs to have a major discussion about what that might look like. But what are some of the ideas that you're thinking about bringing to the table? I want to pitch that to Casey. You're on the House Education Committee. What are some of the things that you've seen discussed?
Yeah, and I've been on House Education for 6 years, and when you sit on a committee, usually you're not an expert, but you get to know that more than like healthcare or something. We had a debate earlier, and I was like, healthcare. But education, we're at a really big issue. We've lost, I think we're down in the last 10 years, 14,000 students, but our spending has gone up $1 billion. There has been, what kind of solutions, and the word merger gets pushed around a lot, and it does scare a lot of rural communities. They're like, that's part of their identity, is having that school in there. And we're in a unique situation where Saint Albans Town has grown by 1,000 people in the last 10 years, and our student population, we actually might be overgrowing some of our schools in Saint Albans Town, which is a good thing to have because it helps us on the tax side. The more students you have, the cheaper it is to educate them. But we're talking mergers in the state, and usually when you talk mergers, it's the rural county or the rural towns. But why are we not looking at like mergers within like the Burlington area? Burlington's building a $300 million school. South Burlington has proposed similar projects, but they have less and less students, and they share football teams and they share hockey teams. Why are we not talking about consolidating in those more quote urban areas where they can consolidate and share schools and share resources? We do a really good job here in Maple Run with sharing resources between city, town, and Fairfield, but that's not the reality. In like, you go to the Northeast Kingdom, they're spread out, they're busing hours a day. It's not, we're in a very unique situation because of how rural our state is. But we also are looking at school construction costs, and we're looking at, it's like $500 million a year for 21 years in order to get all of our needs that we need in construction. So we really need to look at the future of education when it comes to how those classrooms look. But we've done some really good things, and I think one of the bills we passed last year out of our committee, and I forget if it was in 23 or 24, we're introducing kids to the tech centers, to the trades, in 6th grade, and that introduction to the trades, because we have a workforce that needs help, that we need bodies to work in these positions, in these skilled positions, and not to jump ahead talking about other things. And we talk about affordability and education. What solves all of our problems is, and Mike hit on it, is housing. We build houses, you can bring more people here. You build houses, you expand your grand lists, cheaper taxes. You build housing, you can deal with our unhoused population.
Oh, we'll get there.
And you can make rents cheaper. And that's the answer to, I think, all of our stuff, to all of our questions is more housing. But we are focused on this education because we owe it. We are actually constitutionally obligated to take care of, educate our children.
Oh, yeah.
And we're one of the oldest
But at
constitutions
what
that has
cost?
that.
But at what cost?
Right.
So pitching it back to Joe, because one, you haven't talked for a little bit, and two, education is obviously a major part of this affordability conversation. As you hear some of these ideas of mergers and districts, like, what are some of your thoughts? What are your ideas on these?
Well, we need to recognize the entire education system and its various cost centers. And I think what we really need to do in order to proceed in an earnest manner is to speak with stakeholders in the trade, educators, supervisory unions, frontline teachers, other people in the building. I'm primarily an automotive service manager. So if I had some people outside my industry problem solve how I was going to create 10% cost savings and provide similar or better product without input from myself or other people in my trade, they're probably going to give me some pretty cruddy recommendations. So one thing that I think is really incumbent on us as a state is for there to be some correlation between what districts approve for budgets and what the property taxes are in those districts. So, we have a situation here in, Maple Run. We passed our budget first time through this year. But if you go one district north, in the district that encompasses Swanton, Highgate, and Franklin, they had to go to their third vote for the budget to pass. There were several $1 million cut out of that budget, but the several $1 million of savings didn't stay in that district. They're spread throughout the entire state, and I don't think that's equitable. It's not fair. In the case of Missisquoi Valley Union on 78, they needed a parking lot redone, and it's not redone, and it's really not a want. It was a need. So I think there needs to be some concurrence on per capita spending within a district that's provided by the state, and that the balance should be, if a district wants to spend beyond that number, those money should be raised within the district. Yeah. If Burlington wants to spend $300 million on a high school, I'm not particularly keen about shouldering a big hunk of that as a resident of St. Albans City. And I'll go out on a limb and speak for the folks in Swanton, Franklin, and Highgate, because I don't think they are either, when they can't even scrape money together for a parking lot.
Sure.
So can I jump in there, Josh?
Sure.
So this year, we did several things to change the way that education finance is going to work in future years and set us on a path to get at some of the things that Joe was just talking about. And I'm glad to hear the endorsement of one of the things that we did, which is to make it so that your excess spending beyond a certain number of dollars per pupil is now going to have an impact on your local tax rate in a way that it really hasn't since we passed Act 60, back when I was 13 years old. We talk about the legislature a lot as like the boogeyman or the thing to blame. But, almost 30 years ago, we had a situation in the state of Vermont where you had rich towns and poor towns. So towns with a big grand list could have a low tax rate and have the same per pupil spending as a poorer town with less money on the grand list that needed a higher tax rate to provide exactly the same education. Taxpayers across the state helped BFA fund a $5 million connector project. Like, we spread that cost around the whole state, and it's easy to sort of like point fingers at one school district needing to spend more, but our voters this year passed a budget that increased from about $69 million to over $77 million. And I felt really confident that if we could get the property tax increase as low as possible and do something to get at a point that Joe made earlier around retirees, we expanded the property tax credit so that people who are in households that make less than around $130,000 a year get more back as a credit to help pay for their property taxes. And so that the people who could least afford to pay, that we blunted the impact of the cost increases. But I think what's really important with this education conversation is that we look to the future and say, are we going to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in buildings that are built for the size of the student population we think we're going to have or the one we have now. And I am really loath to invest in a lot more capital construction across the state, especially in the lower populated places, when we haven't gotten a handle on communities like we just saw in central Vermont that know they can save money, know they don't have enough students to be running as many elementary schools as they do. The administration and many people involved in the district that care about their kids there want to consolidate, and it can't get local voters to give up on a building. And that, to me, seems like the state, we as legislators in the next session, need to come in and give the right mix of forcing and incentive and disincentive to get some of those places where it's just obvious that it's going to be better for students and save money if we do some of that consolidation. But I want to stay focused on providing the right investment for our students to make sure that we're providing a better education. And right now, I think in too many communities, we're stuck on the building rather than the students as the priority.
Yeah, there's a lot there to unpack from all y'all's answers there. Joe and Casey here. Casey, there's obviously a lot going on in the education committee, but there's kind of this idea of a floor of spending that the state could set, which additional school districts could spend above. Is that kind of what I'm hearing, Joe?
It's precisely what I was talking about.
Yeah.
I think there should be an allocation. It can be modified for various things like
Sure.
Special needs, English as a second language, whereby if districts spend beyond this cap, that the money's raised strictly within the district.
Yeah. I want to pitch that idea over to Zach.
It is so that when voters vote on the school budget, they actually understand what it is they're voting on.
Yeah.
Because right now they don't. One can vote on a school budget, and there is no way any reasonable person can tell you what that means for your property taxes or for your rent,
Yeah.
because it's incumbent on what all the other districts do.
Yeah.
And it's not an equitable system.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of the runaway spending comes from, because nobody feels like they're responsible for the state as a whole.
But so much of this education discussion tends to pin around the ideas of complexity. Well, one, the education system itself has become so complex, it's hard to effectively make the changes that you would like to make on it. And equity, right? Obviously, the law that was passed, I don't know the exact time when the property tax law was changed. For the
In the spring, and then we made the final.
Well, I'm talking about when you initially set out the system.
When Act 60 was passed in 1997? Yeah, it's 1997.
Yeah, 1997. So
years ago.
It's been in place for a while now, but it sounds like that was initially put in place to try to make an equitable system at some point. And here we are at the point where we're arguing that we may not have that system as equitable as we'd like it to be. So I'm curious on where do we go from here? That's always the question for me. So Zach, hearing kind of this floor idea with stuff on top, that's we already have that up to a point, is what Mike was saying.
It'll go into effect for this next tax year, because
Gotcha.
we did that in the yield bill this year.
So I guess my question being, do you think that's a solution that could be worked on, or do you think that people are afraid of losing the programs that they're looking at, basically losing their equitable system?
I think with this big, this education system we have in the state, we've been talking about a lot of things, housing, this, that, and the other thing. We've been talking about our population. I think it demands a scale of funding to address, these needs in each community. I think about my kindergarten teacher, Ms. Coda. She's the superintendent up in the Richford, Enosburg area for that school district. And she just talks about the immense needs that students have there. Immense and unique needs, right? So looking forward, we need a system, and regardless of, what the exact mechanics of that look like, that'll be worked out in the study committee moving forward, right? We need a system that can address these needs county by county, district by district, right? And just to expand a little bit more on that, from what I understand of this conversation, is you need just stresses the importance of honest information, right? As legislators, I think it's really important, and as districts and as communities, to address this complexity, this issue of complexity head on, and communicate with their communities to explain what's going on, to explain that, this school has needs that are being funded, connector programs, building infrastructure, student needs, and other communities have unique needs. So, something that I'd like to see in the future is like a more informed public discourse about what these budgets mean, and that's a responsibility that falls partly on legislators, but school administrators as well, to communicate some of this complexity and make it a little bit more clear for voters. I think that benefits everybody.
And if I may jump in, I'm a product of public schools. I went to Saint Albans City School, I went to BFA, went to Castleton.
I'm assuming this is after 97.
This is, I was right in the middle of that.
Right in the middle.
I was in 7th grade in 97.
Okay, gotcha.
It's easy. They made it easy for me because every year that was the grade I was in. So 97, I was in 7th grade. But now my kids, they attend SATEC in the town, and we have great teachers and staff. We had an open house last night in Saint Albans Town. It was fantastic to hear the progress that my kids are going through and seeing the work they're doing. But the issue that we talk, and that's the number one goal, right, is what our kids are doing in the classroom and making sure that they get the best out of it. But when you take a view of it from a legislative standpoint, we spend $2.4 billion to educate 80,000 students. Now, is that the right number we should be at? Is that the right number? Is that fair to our property taxpayers? I don't know if that's where we should be. We've seen such a climb that adds to our affordability crisis here. Those property taxes this year, for me, it means less Christmas presents or less programs that we can send our kids to, maybe not going out to dinner and stuff. These are real decisions people have to make because of these costs. But we have a system right now in Vermont that incentivizes high spending districts because, like Joe had mentioned, if we don't pass this budget increase, somebody else will. So why not, if you don't use it, you lose it. So why not spend the money and it's going to get funded? And this affected us last year in Act 127. And I don't want to get into the weeds on anything, but Act 127, which is how we weight our students, that's where we saw a large increase on this because you saw some districts lose taxing capacity, but they still overspent their taxing capacity. And then the ones that gained taxing capacity obviously took their taxing capacity, and that's where you saw the largest increases in why we got to our spending. So I think we need to really look at incentivizing districts to be within what's right. We need, what's the right amount of money to educate one child in the state of Vermont?
Yeah.
And what's fair?
Well, I just wanted to clarify. I believe there was some work in terms of changing the incentive formula at some point.
Yeah, so I helped write H850 along with the chair of the Ways and Means and the chair of the Education Committee. I know Representative Toof was on the education side of that bill, and my part of it was entirely about mechanics because what we asked schools to do was kind of unprecedented. We realized that the systemic pressures that had caused healthcare 16% increase, right? Not school boards don't have any control over that, right? And we can get into healthcare and the cost shift and why that's not being driven by schools, but it affects school spending, right? A lot of deferred maintenance. There were a bunch of schools that just had to put on a new roof or needed, some kind of capital project. The end of some federal funding and the need to continue things like behavioral and mental health staff in a lot of schools. So those sort of systemic pressures really, in a year where we were just getting used to this change in the pupil weighting to try to make things more equitable and fair. That's what Act 127 was designed to do. But it did create a really perverse incentive for districts that were already spending a lot to spend a little bit more. And so what we did is midstream, after they'd already warned budgets, we went out and said, no, that's actually going to have a real impact on you if you just keep moving forward with this additional $3, $4, $5 million. And with H850, we actually got a bunch of districts to go back, rewarn their budgets, and reduce the total ed spend by about $50 million, which was helpful to get that, what would have been over a 20% statewide average property tax increase, down to more like 13. And, this was a particularly difficult year, and it had a lot of factors that were outside of both school board's control and the legislature's control. But one of those big factors really had to do with the pressure of the benefits like healthcare and the cost of staff. I mean, we are already in a position where it's hard to attract staff to fill open positions.
Well, there you go. There's my segue for me. Hard to attract staff into positions. We have a housing problem in Vermont, which I think everybody is at least aware of some some fact of some expression of that. I'm not going to go into the depth of the issue. I think we're all aware of it. There have been so many housing assessment studies. If anybody wants to know how bad the housing problem is, just find one of those. The state has done plenty of them. So, question to Zach here. Start talking about housing. There always seems to be this, we need it, but who builds it? Like, does the state need to step up its responsibility? Does the markets? Do we encourage the markets? What is your thoughts on some of this, on our way out of this problem?
Yeah, and just to underscore the issue, I think about my dad who works in human resources over at the Shelton Paper Mill, and how he talks about a history in Shelton where the company provided housing for its workers. There are issues with that. Obviously, if you're not working for the company anymore, do you still have the house, right? That's a big question. But his perspective also is that there are folks who would make good employees if they have the stability and resources to do so. And these companies desperately need people, right? I hear about folks tenting out in areas who work in manufacturing, and they're tenting out and working full-time jobs and simply can't find housing. So just to underscore the need, it's working people, it's folks who are looking to downsize from their larger homes into smaller homes, people across ages, incomes, and at work, the most painful work that I have to do at work is facilitate discussions of people trying to find homes, people who had families, pets, and full-time jobs who simply no longer have a home. And in a lot of cases, the most painful cases, are where property owners sell the property, the new owners move everybody out, evict everybody to redo or reimagine the property, right? So, I would love to see some incentives to bring down the cost of building materials. I think that some of these projects, particularly these multifamily units, the project management and the scale of them is just so big that you're going to need some concentrated resources and developers to do that, right? So lowering building costs would be a huge help, and I think the state can help out with that. Beyond that, who takes care of the problem, right? I would hope that municipalities meet this, moment and, review their zoning regulations, unless the state has, more of a say in that going forward, right? So, I see it's the primary duty of the state of Vermont to provide, to lower those housing costs, those building costs, those capital costs of those buildings, and also, do what they can. There was a bill recently to reimagine Act 250 and some of the permitting and zoning there. So I feel like the combination of broadening regulations at this moment and also providing incentives and and funds to lower those those stand-up costs would be really great. That would be a real big step forward into this future where, housing is one of the most fundamental elements of a good life. Being able to take a shower every day so you can go to work or get hired to go to work is huge and fundamental. And so kind of two-pronged approach of raising funds to fund building, talking to the people who already can do it, they're trained to do it, they have the resources to do it. I think we need to focus efforts there on top of, widening the road a little bit so we can, funnel more housing and more housing projects in the state of Vermont in growth areas that I think make the most sense given the state of our infrastructure right now. Yeah.
I want to extend the conversation to either Joe or Casey. Do you see the state's responsibility in terms of lowering building costs or making it more easier to build? Or
I think that it's incumbent upon the state to make the regulatory process easier. So Act 250 is really a box that has a litany of processes within it. So this past year, the legislature, they largely eviscerated local zoning for communities that have municipal sewer and water. So you have a place like St. Albans City, which is already doing the right thing. We have a very large project about to go online on Lake Street. There's another one at the former Fonda site. And at the same time, the legislature basically took our land development regulations and threw them in the garbage can, because they said, we don't know what we need in St. Albans. And so I think that really used a cleaver for an approach that should have utilized a scalpel. I think what a better way of framing that would have been, St. Albans City, we're looking at where you're at. You need to produce X number of units in a certain amount of time, or we're going to have to loosen up your land development regs. So a derivative of that is that we can get some really undesired housing in St. Albans now, and there are neighborhoods that can just completely lose their character. Any single family house is a duplex now, and I would encourage you to just survey the city and see where some of those applications aren't going to lend themselves to a positive living environment. I certainly don't argue that there needs to be more housing, but I would argue, and Mike spoke to it earlier, that the city's already doing that. It's my turn to speak, I think. At the same time,
I thought you'd finish your thought. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
At the same time, we've taken areas that don't have municipal sewer and water, and actually we haven't not only not made it easier, we've made it harder to do business there, like places like Sheldon or most other parts of the state, as you look on a map. And we basically said, we really don't want you developing at all, and if you're going to live there, you need to be a wealthy person, because the rest of you need to go to the village centers.
Sure, yeah. Casey, you want to piggyback off of that, or Mike, you want to piggyback off of that?
I do want to jump in.
So I want to say, getting out of the world of rhetoric and talk about actually what we did with H687. We, in large part, in the places where I think everyone can agree we want to see more housing and development, we removed duplicative regulation. We took away the need to do both, city or town complex permitting and Act 250 at the same time. Much of what keeps us from building housing in Vermont isn't about Act 250 at all. It's really about the kind of density that, with these very broad character of the area provisions. And in my neighborhood, I live right next door to an owner-occupied multi-unit building that has the same footprint and meets all the same design parameters that a single family would. And I think, Joe lives in an owner-occupied multi-unit building too. It's not that they're bad for our neighborhoods. And I think that as long as we didn't eviscerate the zoning, because you still, if you're able to maybe have some more density in that footprint, you still need to meet all the design and other requirements that you would if you were doing a single family home there. So it's not as if, you can build, some cheap, terrible looking thing. You've still got to have it meet all of the other design requirements. And so I think there's a balance that we need to strike in order to get the housing that we need, because what we have is a supply problem. And it's in large part driven by local regulation from people who essentially say, not in my backyard, I don't want anybody else to live here. I've got my place and I like the way it is and I don't want anything to change. And in Vermont, especially given our changing demographics, that is the biggest impediment, and I think we struck the right balance in H687 by taking away some local control and allowing for some more density, but also removing the duplicative, complex burdens of Act 250 in places where it really was just another layer of bureaucracy. So I think we struck the right compromise, and we'll continue to work on it and see if it does advance the kind of housing that we want to see. But the only way we get these big multi-units done in St. Albans is because the city council, which I was on for a few years, has supported an active real estate approach where we've gotten into the market and fixed problems, pulled together brownfield funding to take blighted sites and put together very complex funding stacks. Many communities in Vermont do not have the expertise or the ability to do what we've done here in the city of St. Albans. And so that's another factor that in my role as the government operations chair, been trying to figure out how do we better help more communities in the state take advantage of federal and state resources to do the kind of development they want to do while still maintaining the things we love about Vermont and protecting the environment.
There's definitely a lot of approaches to housing here. And we're talking about, money going towards certain things, loosening up regulations, trying to pay our way out of it partially. But I want to pitch some of the prior conversations, some of the topics that Joe's bringing up to Casey here, talking about factors of the state's efforts to kind of hypercharge housing. Do you think that some of this changes have made to Act 250 might be detrimental to St. Albans and its neighborhoods?
Well, the problem with the bill, the H687 that was mentioned, is it didn't really go through the Housing Committee until very late in the session. So there wasn't really a lot of talk about housing. It was more of an Act 250 bill. And so that was there was a lot of frustration within that committee for not being able to take up that bill till really late in the session. And so we do make some investments. I want to just point out to one of the governor's programs, VHIP, Vermont Housing Improvement Program.
Quick note here, at this point in the interview, I ended up interrupting Casey with incorrect info. His point, however, was that the Scott-endorsed Vermont Housing Improvement Program costs less per unit created, or about $30,000 to $50,000, depending on the size of the project.
Was it the Vermont Chamber, I think, said that we need around 65,000 new houses, new homes, new units to be able to be where we need to be. And we also, I think what we're also forgetting about is we need to work on the infrastructure, because we are allowing the city centers to where there is water and wastewater. We need to improve those systems in those areas, because they're already having overflows with the population they have now. And if we're going to increase the population in those areas, we need to make sure that we're not further polluting our lakes and rivers and streams and everything. But I think that with a lot of good talk, I think there is an appetite in the legislature where everybody knows that is down there, and everyone that's running knows that we need more houses, we need more housing units online. And there's more discussion. There's more discussion to come next year, and I'm sure that will be on the plate. And I'm really hopeful that we actually pull it and it goes into the housing committee and they can spend a lot of time on it.
Yeah. This discussion goes so many different ways. All right, so final topic here. I want to talk a little bit about public safety. And public safety is starting to become a broader and broader term these days. But I know that there's some strong feelings on public safety in Saint Albans City these days, especially at downtown. I've seen multiple of you at many of these ongoing public safety discussions held by the city. There's been a lot of chatter in person online. But one thing is clear, people are worried about people engaging in crimes downtown. But I'm curious about the broader context here. So my question is for Joe here. The behaviors that we're seeing are the ongoing results of just an incredibly complex system. And I'm curious about what levers do you think could be focused on differently? What would you do differently? Is it changes in social services? We look at the justice system, or we look at policing? Where's kind of your focus? What are you looking at in terms of how St. Albans City might be able to and get help from the state in terms of addressing some of these issues?
Well, I think the perspective of the vast majority of people in the district, and I would say in the state and statewide, is that our downtowns are less safe than they were a few years ago. There's a litany of reasons for that, and none of these issues live in their own silo, right? They're all interconnected to a great degree. But I think the state of Vermont, and it's not a partisan issue, needs to invest more money in mental health services and substance abuse abatement, and that can't just be an outpatient thing. There needs to be residential services that frankly don't exist to the extent they do. We need to be able to get these people off the street in some sort of housing in a manner that we can fund. And I think to a certain degree you need to look at a congregate housing type format there for various reasons. And there are some people you're just not going to get off the street. You go talk to Ben Kaufman down on Kingman Street, and he'll tell any of us, there's some folks that just aren't going to come in. And with that, that's the way it is. You can't force somebody to accept housing, though I got to believe the vast majority of the people on the street would be very, very happy to have some housing. At the same time, there needs to be accountability for bad behavior. It's illegal to shoot up drugs on the street, although police will drive by, and it's just a normal thing now. And it's not that they don't care. It's that nothing will happen if you pick up somebody for selling petty amounts of drugs or for doing drugs on the street. Massachusetts, which is not considered to be a red state by any stretch of the imagination, you get caught robbing somebody to support your drug habit, or sticking a needle in your arm on the street, or doing some petty drug dealing, you either are going to have a set amount of time in a residential rehab, or you're going to have a set amount of time in prison. Take your pick. And the fact that we have a very weak sense of consequences for bad behavior, and there's been a little bit of window dressing this year with bail reform, but I would say a little bit. We're really encouraging people to continue to rob things off your porch, and that needs to stop.
Sure. Zach, I want to extend the conversation over to you. Do you agree with some of the solutions that Joe expanded on? Increased beds, did you increase penalties? Is that something that you're looking at or thinking about?
I think it's a carrot and a stick thing.
Yeah.
Okay, Vermont never legalized opiate use on the streets. In fact, but we've essentially decriminalized it in the sense that there's no longer any penalty for it. It's just accepted as it's almost a normalized behavior.
Sure. Yeah, but more beds. Zach, do you see this normalization, or do you see potential different solution set maybe towards the justice system or social services or anything like that?
We were talking a lot about endpoints there. One nugget that I would agree with Joe on is that this is what we're seeing our neighbors go through, what we're seeing our families go through, is the result of a lot of interconnected issues. I mean, we've been talking about them tonight: housing, et cetera, healthcare, and there was talk of endpoints, right? Our mental health, services, and our corrections facilities, and our community housing stuff. Those are endpoints. I'd love to have more of a conversation about prevention and preventative care, because while I do agree that our endpoints, whether it's the criminal justice system, is something that should work and work quickly, much more quickly than it does, and all the other things we talked about. Those are important to work. But when we talk about prevention, investments in housing, temporary or otherwise, would go a long way to provide folks with the stability that they need. And I just want to underscore again that when we're talking about folks who are struggling out on the streets and whatnot, while there are populations that do have more touch points with law enforcement and such, we're dealing with a very diverse and a lot of people who are in different stages of their life, right, and have different needs. Some people do have mental health issues. Others don't. Some people are going through a lack of housing and driven to desperation and doing desperate things. People who are working and are out on the street, present and visible in the streets. So it's folks that are facing a lot of different things in a lot of different ways. And I'm happy to talk about endpoints, whether it's the correction system, criminal justice system, police, mental health, all those things. I agree that those things should work and be funded to work better, right? And you look at the investments that have been made in our court system so that they have more people on hand to process cases more quickly, right? This is something that gets people justice more quickly. This gets folks seeing those consequences, or at least, at the very least, seeing justice more quickly. That's deeply important. But prevention, including access to drug counseling and stuff, is deeply important. Access to housing is deeply important, temporary or otherwise. And just those community supports, like at our shelters, at our food kitchens, and food shelves, like those are all things that are all part of the puzzle, and hopefully head these issues off at the pass before they become visible issues in our parks and on our streets. I just want to mention that and underscore that prevention is a deeply important part of this conversation and needs to be funded and treated as such.
Sure. I want to go over to Casey here. Next question for you. In terms of
Zach brought up the idea of prevention and endpoints in terms of trying to reposition this conversation a little bit. I also want to bring up the concept of money. Everybody's talking about programs that need funded, and so that's how we started this podcast for a reason, because all this stuff costs money. So, I mean, what do you see in terms of where should the state be focusing its dollars on to help solve this issue?
I think that there's a broad issue across. We're not unique, right? St. Albans is not unique. Other communities are dealing with this, and those representatives are going to come to the State House with the same ideas that we need to fix this. And I think prevention is a very important thing. I think when the Appropriations Committee sits down with the budget, they look at what are our top goals and what do we need to make sure we need to fund. And I think mental health services and substance abuse preventative measures and treatments are things that really we need to invest in. And I think that's what we're going to be looking at when we go back there. But Joe's right. Accountability. People in St. Albans have the right to feel safe in their homes, and they don't feel safe in their community right now with all this going on. I coach Little League. I coach soccer. One of the things we go down and you find paraphernalia in the dugouts, and we can't allow the kids in until we sweep it. That concerns me, that my kids aren't safe in the community when things like that are going on. And so we need to look at hold people accountable for this. We need to give the people the treatment. I like the idea of looking at, you're arrested for this, or you're in trouble for this, we're going to get you help, or you're going to go, like Joe said, you have the option. That's what Massachusetts is doing. But we need to look at things like repeat offenders. We need to look at things like that bail reform bill from before I was in there. I forget what it was, but what's going to work for our community. And we do need to help people. Like, we can't be heartless. We have to help the people. They're obviously struggling if they don't have a home. I think a lot of the things we talked about, affordability, housing, making housing units available would help. But I think that we really need to focus on what's good for St. Albans. I really feel like the people of St. Albans have the right to feel safe in their community.
Yeah. I do want to make a point that feeling safe is a subjective feeling. I rode Route 105 yesterday in the dark and the rain. I did not feel safe.
Right.
But I do not want 105 to be torn up.
Right.
Same question over to Mike in terms of prevention, endpoints, money. Where do we go?
Yeah, well, this year, you can see in my record that we're willing to prioritize and make investments in both the criminal justice system and in mental health. We're not doing enough, but we did several things this year that are already starting to make a difference. The lifting the $200 bail cap has already taken somebody off the street who was repeatedly going through cars and stealing things in our neighborhood, and we haven't had an incident since that person came off the street. We've seen several releases from the police where they're talking about how the state's attorney asked for higher bail and got it on where there were theft issues recently, and that's because we changed the bail laws with S-195 and rolled back some of those reforms that had capped bail at $200 before I was in the legislature. But I want to get back to some of these get into the details of some of what we're talking about with treatment. There was a letter that was just put out by a number of professionals, including a Republican Rutland legislator, that were basically saying, look, it costs $95,000 to incarcerate somebody for a year in Vermont. It would be way cheaper if we have longer-term residential recovery houses and give people a step down. That's really the biggest missing part in moving people from treatment to recovery. I, like probably everybody at this table, have lost people close to me and have had family struggle with substance use, and some get into recovery and some not make it. And I think anybody our age has been to too many funerals for kids they went to high school with around opiates. But these opiates that are on the street right now are more addictive, more deadly, and they have a higher satiation rate. And we did not adapt fast enough with our policing or our mental health system, but we've already started to take some steps. I hope that the people of St. Albans will see what progress we are making to adapt and help support some of these investments moving forward. But I haven't been afraid to say, we live in a time of increased inequality. We just saw in the income data that came out that wealthy Vermonters are doing a lot better and poorer Vermonters are doing worse. And I think that we should continue to make our tax system more progressive. We've made some changes to corporate income tax laws to do that, and to invest those funds in things like, longer term residential support for people who are choosing to get their lives back together. So, yeah, I think there's been too, at the same time, the community's come together to do cleanup. So there was this. There's some exaggeration and misconception in the community because people are afraid. So there are legitimate fears and legitimate concerns, and then some of the conversation on social media has really led people to believe that it's much worse than it actually is, and I think that in itself is harmful to our community. So I want to validate and acknowledge that, yeah, we do have a problem with opiates, drugs, and the crime that comes with it, but also not lose our empathy, to look at how we've come so far in the last 20 years in St. Albans and not get panicked, but use our concern to drive solutions rather than freaking out.
Yeah, as we said earlier, we could probably discuss these things for hours. They're all incredibly slippery and delicate situations. Yeah, I wish we could offer I wish we would have solved all the answers, or I wish we would have found all the answers and solved all the world's problems. But I don't know if we could do that in an hour. I don't have a really great way of wrapping this up right now.
Well, what if we come back for 12 hours on November 5th? That way none of us have to stand outside the polling center, and it would be fair.
Great. All right. Bipartisan agreement all the way around, especially if it's under 30 degrees.
We all agree on that no one can stand in the snow on the way.
You're like, none of it? Yeah, you don't have to worry about the other person being there because we're all here.
That's a really good point. Yeah, there's some people have had health issues standing out on election day before, so that's dangerous.
All right. That's it. Thanks for listening.